Hey guys, tonight we're plunging, nose first, into the gloriously grimy world of Queen Elizabeth I. Yes, that Elizabeth. The one with the ruffs, the fiery speeches, and the glowing image of regal perfection. Only, she wasn't glowing because of cleanliness. No, no. She was glowing because her skin was literally coated in lead, and she hadn't touched water in weeks. Maybe months. The year is 1580 something. You're standing in the Queen's private chambers in Whitehall Palace. The air is thick. Not with incense or candle smoke, but with a warm, musky fog of perfume, old velvet, and bodies that have only heard of soap in theory. The tapestries are heavy, trapping heat like a wool blanket in July. And the smell? It's like someone tried to bake old cheese inside a velvet pouch and left it to ferment under a throne. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I promise not to judge your insomnia. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You glide, slowly, through the palace halls. Every surface feels aged and slightly sticky. There are no toilets here, no running water, no air fresheners. And yet, this is the very heart of Tudor power, beating steadily beneath a mountain of unwashed brocade. Queen Elizabeth sits perched on her ornate chair, posture perfect despite the heat. Her face is ghost white, her hair a rigid crown of curled flame, which we'll discuss more later, and her gown looks like it weighs more than a toddler. She is regal. Unbothered. And, let's be honest, smelling like last week's rosewater poured over stale sweat. There are bowls of dried herbs at her feet, supposed to purify the air. Spoiler alert, they don't. Courtiers stand nearby, smiling with strained politeness as they try to breathe through their perfumed sleeves. This was Elizabeth's normal. You, on the other hand, are choking slightly. Now, historians still argue whether Elizabeth's court was significantly filthier than those of her European counterparts. France, after all, had its own perfume problems. But there's little disagreement that the English court was a sensory adventure. The royal apartments lacked proper ventilation. They had rushes on the floors, not charming wildflowers, but bundles of straw soaked in ale and mixed with dried lavender to cover up, shall we say, bodily incidents. Those rushes were replaced maybe once a season. Maybe. One unfortunate ambassador, sent from the more fastidious Spanish court, wrote privately of the grievous odor that permeated Whitehall. He described the stench as earthy, sour, and oily with rot. That's the diplomatic version. You pause near a window, one of the few that actually opens, and stick your nose toward the narrow gap in the glass lattice. Bad move. The Thames, just outside, is functioning as a massive, citywide sewer. Its smell drifts in on the breeze like a wet slap. Somewhere, a fish has died. Possibly several. Back inside, a page tiptoes across the chamber with a silver basin and a cloth. He places it near the Queen but doesn't dare speak. The basin contains rosewater, not for washing, mind you, but for sniffing. Or dabbing gently on the hands when she's feeling especially fragrant. Elizabeth doesn't bathe. That's not an insult, it's a quote. She once famously told a foreign dignitary that she bathed once a month, whether I need it or not. A statement that would be funny if she were joking. She wasn't. And bathing wasn't just avoided out of laziness. The Tudor elite genuinely believed water opened your pores to disease. Bathing was for peasants and the sick. Or both. Instead, the elite cleaned themselves using linen cloths, rubbing and scraping at the skin until they felt refreshed, which is court speak for less itchy. Oh, and while we're talking about rubbing, oils, powders, and scented balms were common. A kind of dry cleaning for the body. The result? A layered aroma of musk, mildew, and what one courtier politely described as a herbal garden in decline. So you sit, trying not to gag, as Elizabeth receives visitors, signs letters, and entertains poets. Every time someone bows or kneels, the movement stirs up a faint gust of what's clinging to them, like dust, but wetter. The air never settles. But the Queen is calm, commanding, charismatic. Even as you fantasize about hosing the place down, you can't help but respect her poise. This is her turf. Her nose has long since stopped noticing the funk. Yours? Not so much. And just when you think your nose might go on strike, the Queen gestures toward her silver fan, its silk panels lightly dabbed with civet musk and crushed roses. It wafts toward you. Better. Not good. But better. You remain in the Queen's presence, your senses still under siege, when a maid enters carrying a tray filled with mysterious little jars and pots. It's time for the daily ritual, the transformation of Elizabeth from a middle-aged monarch with dental issues and a questionable odor into the iconic Gloriana of portraits and legend. And the first step? Paint. You watch as her ladies-in-waiting gently dab a thick white paste across her cheeks and forehead. This isn't makeup like you'd imagine from your drugstore aisle, this is Venetian ceruse, a luxurious mixture of vinegar and white lead. Yes, lead. The stuff we now use warnings for on paint cans. This beauty routine is as deadly as it is dramatic. The ceruse is applied in generous strokes, smoothing over blemishes, scarring, and signs of age. Elizabeth had survived smallpox, but her skin hadn't. Beneath the makeup, she carried pitted reminders of the disease. Historians still argue whether she felt ashamed of those scars or simply embraced the beauty standards of her time. Either way, she went full kabuki. Next comes the rouge, usually made from cinnabar or cochineal, the crushed bodies of tiny beetles. The color is vivid, a deep red brushed onto her cheeks and lips. You realize with a jolt that you're staring at something between a royal and a walking chemistry experiment. Her eyebrows are lightly penciled in, sometimes with lampblack, sometimes with kohl, and occasionally darkened with crushed ant eggs. Yes, that's a real thing. And when her natural brows eventually thinned or disappeared altogether, likely from repeated plucking and chemical burns, wigs filled in the rest. And speaking of wigs, today, she wears a striking auburn coif made from the hair of some very unfortunate servant or donor. It's styled high and rigid, coated with starch, and dotted with pearls. You're beginning to suspect her skull is sweating beneath it. Probably has been for hours. Once her face is fully prepared, her ladies dust it with a light layer of crushed pearls. This was not for subtle shimmer, no, Elizabeth wanted to radiate divinity. In portraits, she seems to glow ethereally. In real life, she might have resembled a chalky lighthouse with a faint fishy scent, thanks to the pearl powder reacting with her face oils. Now, while her contemporaries admired her pallor as a sign of nobility, because tan skin meant outdoor labor, there were whispers. Some believed her makeup was slowly poisoning her. Others believed she knew, and didn't care. A few even suggested she had grown addicted to the ritual, terrified to appear without it. After all, what was left beneath all those layers? A sovereign, or simply an aging woman in a world with no mercy for such things? You try not to stare, but it's hard. Her face is a mask, regal, deliberate, otherworldly. And that's the point. This is not Elizabeth the woman, this is Elizabeth the symbol, eternal, untouched, and terrifyingly composed. No sweat, no blemishes, no cracks. Except, you're close enough to see one tiny fissure at the edge of her jawline, where the lead paint doesn't quite reach. Still, she sits motionless as the final touch is applied, a touch of balm made from civet oil, extracted from the glands of a civet cat. The smell is pungent, somewhere between musky leather and old fruit, but it lingers like royalty. And Elizabeth, as always, wears it with confidence. One of her ladies accidentally spills a tiny pot of rouge onto the velvet carpet. She freezes, waiting for a rebuke. The Queen barely glances over. Instead, she arches an eyebrow and mutters, "Better there than on me." A light joke, rare and cutting. The ladies titter nervously. And here's a curious tidbit you may not expect: Elizabeth's obsession with appearance wasn't purely vanity. It was armor. Every inch of paint, every stiff collar, every jeweled pin, these were tools in her arsenal. In a court full of men doubting her ability to rule, she wielded her image like a sword. Even Shakespeare, who never dared portray her directly, referenced her grandeur obliquely, comparing kings to the sun, the moon, and the stars. But no one shone quite like Elizabeth I, even if she was glowing from toxic ingredients and panic sweat under a wig. Now, not everyone in her court bought into the glamour. Foreign visitors often commented, behind closed doors, about the unnaturalness of her look. One Venetian ambassador described her appearance as imposing and radiant, then quickly added that close inspection is unwise. You're starting to agree. She rises from her seat at last, her gown whispering against the carpet as she moves. The room holds its collective breath. Not because she's terrifying, but because any wrong move could crumble the illusion. Literally. That lead paint cracks like clay if she smiles too wide. As she walks past, you notice something smeared faintly on her collar, lip rouge transferred from her chin. No one dares mention it. Certainly not the servants, whose job is to silently admire her even as they dust flakes of white from the floor. The Queen disappears into the corridor, and with her goes the cloud of heavy scent, powder, and political theater. You take a deep breath. Bad idea. The room without her smells somehow worse. You're still reeling from the Queen's theatrical transformation when something strikes you. A subtle, sour tang in the air. Not the perfume, not the herbs, something more biological. You realize it's not just Elizabeth's environment that offends the nose. It's Elizabeth herself. Let's address the fragrant elephant in the room, the Queen's natural scent. Her courtiers never mentioned it in their poetry, of course. But behind closed doors, rumors swirled like unwashed undergarments on laundry day. Whispers of a certain royal musk that clung to her even through the thickest veils of rosewater and ambergris. Elizabeth, the so-called Virgin Queen, might have been a paragon of chastity, but she was no icon of freshness. You trail her down the hall, keeping a polite 6-foot buffer, not for plague protocols, but for scent protection. Her train sweeps behind her, gliding like a small ship made of velvet and pearls. Beneath that gown, linen chemises. Many of them. Because if you're not going to wash yourself, you can at least layer the stench. She changes underlayers frequently, sometimes daily, sometimes every few days depending on the occasion. But even with clean shifts, her skin rarely touches water. Imagine trying to keep a sourdough starter fresh by wrapping it in dry cloth. That's roughly the hygiene logic here. And yet, somehow, her presence still commands awe. Is it the posture? The voice? Or the sheer confidence that says, yes, I smell like an antique spice drawer and you will bow anyway? Now, one of her ladies-in-waiting approaches with a small, embroidered pouch. You assume it's another perfume sachet, but no, it's something better. Inside are fresh rosemary leaves, dried orange peels, and a few sprigs of lavender. The Queen holds it to her nose between audiences. A portable filter for the court stench, though she's the primary contributor. And yet, Elizabeth was far from alone in her scent situation. This was a time before daily showers, before deodorants, before people realized that bathing didn't cause the plague. In fact, many nobles believed body odor was a natural part of life, so natural, it almost carried social weight. A well-born stench, if you will. Still, there are accounts, faint, muffled, and often hidden in footnotes, of courtiers privately lamenting their sovereign's aroma. One French visitor, in a letter never meant for publication, wrote, "She shines like the moon and smells of an orchard left too long in the sun." Beautiful. Horrifying. And while you'd expect her scent to mellow with age, it may have gotten worse. Elizabeth's health began declining in her later years, and with it, her tolerance for change, including clean clothes and fresh linens. She once refused to let anyone remove her old bedding for fear it had been enchanted. Spoiler, it hadn't. But it probably needed fumigation. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's so-called aroma was exaggerated by her enemies. After all, the Spanish hated her guts, and likely her soap choices. But the consistency of quiet complaints from neutral visitors suggests there was something memorable about the air around her. Of course, we must consider the contrast. Most common folk in Tudor England didn't exactly smell like citrus groves either. Bathing was rare. Soap was lye-based and smelled like wet firewood. Water was cold and often deadly. So, maybe Elizabeth was just keeping up with the scent standards of her kingdom. Still, the nobles did what they could. Layers of lace weren't just for show, they absorbed sweat. Glove linings were perfumed. Hair was dusted with powdered herbs. Even the floors were sprinkled with dried rushes mixed with dried lavender, mint, or chamomile. Every element of the court was scented to mask, never to cleanse. Even so, you start to wonder, what did it mean to be near power in this world? You weren't just enduring the Queen's moods, you were enduring her musk. To serve Elizabeth was to hold your breath with a smile. And yet, she knew. She must have known. There's a small anecdote, half apocryphal, half believed, of Elizabeth once turning to a diplomat after an especially long day in council and saying, "I fear I have lingered too long among my own roses." Which is, polite, poetic code for, I am ripe. She had a sense of humor about it, if nothing else. But don't mistake that for carelessness. The Queen's scent was just another layer of her weaponized persona. She wielded it like she wielded her words, bold, unapologetic, commanding. After all, would you tell your monarch she smelled like a traveling cheese merchant? Exactly. So you follow her still, nose acclimating slightly, head swimming in floral decay. And just as you think you've adjusted, she turns sharply and offers her gloved hand. It's beautiful, ivory leather, embroidered with silver thread, and faintly tinted with orris root and amber. You kiss it gently, as custom demands. It smells, not terrible. You realize she's wearing scented gloves. An entire court fashion built around hiding the hand's natural funk with soaked linings and perfumed seams. This was no accident. It was intentional. And you start to wonder, how much of Elizabeth's hygiene was a carefully balanced performance? How much was theatrical deflection? How much was just survival in a world with no plumbing? Whatever the answer, one thing is clear, Elizabeth might not have smelled like victory. But she was victorious, and no amount of musk could drown that out. You wake up, figuratively, we hope, realizing that while Elizabeth's outer image is armor, her approach to personal cleanliness, or lack thereof, is no mere quirk. It is doctrine. The Queen of England does not bathe. At least, not by your 21st century understanding of the word. Elizabeth was proud, openly proud, of her avoidance of immersion. According to a handful of stunned foreign ambassadors and the occasional cheeky court gossip, she boasted about how infrequently she took baths. One famous quote, almost too grim to believe, "I have a bath once a month, whether I need it or not." You trail her as she enters her privy chamber, not quite a bathroom, not quite a bedroom, but something in between. A place for solitude, for comfort, for wiping down the day's grime with a bit of cloth and prayer. There's no bath waiting for her. No steaming tub, no fragrant oils. Just a padded stool, a basin, and a folded linen known as a body cloth. The Queen washes with this, dipping the cloth into rosewater or warmed vinegar and gently patting her face, neck, arms. Like spot cleaning an antique. Never scrubbing. Never soaking. And certainly never dunking herself into a full bath unless she was sick, or threatened by plague. You can almost hear the voice of her physicians ringing through time, bathing opens the pores. The humors escape. Disease enters. To Elizabeth and her court, water was suspicious. It was the province of the poor and the dangerously misinformed. Stepping into it willingly was practically an act of self-endangerment. Even among her nobles, full-body baths were rare. When they happened, they were ceremonial. The tub would be a high-sided wooden affair, fitted with linen linings, sometimes filled with herbs, sometimes perfumed, but the logistics were absurd. Heating enough water took hours. Privacy was limited. Cleanup was miserable. Now imagine being the monarch. Elizabeth's courtiers would have had to coordinate with her ladies-in-waiting, clear the chamber, prepare the linens, boil cauldrons of water, and fetch bundles of dried herbs, like lavender or chamomile. Simply to encourage the illusion of freshness. And even then, the Queen often refused. Too risky. Too damp. So what did she do instead? She relied on dry methods. Powdered starch to absorb sweat. Spiced oils rubbed on pulse points. Layers of fresh linen worn beneath heavy garments to protect her outer clothes from becoming rank too quickly. If a spot started to smell, replace the chemise. Leave the skin untouched. And the most consistent tool in her hygiene arsenal, rosewater. It was everywhere. Used for face washing, hand dabbing, even breath freshening. You watch as a maid offers her a goblet with a trace of rosewater swirled in. She swishes, spits discreetly into a cloth. Elegant. Repulsive. Tudor chic. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth truly avoided water completely. There are some contradictory records, moments when she may have bathed after illness, or before major ceremonies. But there's little evidence she embraced it as a routine. One famous account from a visiting noblewoman describes Elizabeth sitting behind a screen while a servant rubbed her down with scented cloths. A dry bath, essentially. The visitor noted that the Queen looked annoyed at the very idea of moisture touching her. Like a cat near rain, she wrote. You watch the process unfold now. A servant gently pats the Queen's arms with what appears to be a cloth soaked in rosemary vinegar. Another sprinkles orris root on her sleeves to cover the lingering body odor. The Queen's face remains neutral, her hands extended like a statue being restored, not bathed, but preserved. The room smells, layered. You can pick out lavender, something lemony, maybe even thyme. All designed to cover the truth underneath. But the truth persists. Beneath the pearls and the powder and the perfumes, this monarch has not truly washed in weeks. And here's a curious tidbit you wouldn't expect. Despite this aversion to bathing, Elizabeth was obsessed with cleanliness as a symbol. Her gowns were spotless. Her gloves freshly scented. Her court constantly polished, at least in appearance. She expected her attendants to appear fresh, even if they weren't actually clean. You could smell faintly of musk, but never of filth. Her inner circle was a parade of powdered wigs and perfumed wrists, each one carefully balancing hygiene theater with survival instincts. And still, the irony lingers, she who ruled with a velvet glove never scrubbed the hand inside it. You pause beside a decorative screen as her routine finishes. A final dusting of powdered rose petals is brushed onto her collarbone. A swipe of balm behind her ears. She exhales softly, like a warrior preparing for battle. And maybe that's what all of this is. A battle. Elizabeth is not just the Queen of England. She is a woman aging under scrutiny, refusing to cede ground to time, to decay, to the stink of mortality. If she cannot stop her body from breaking down, she will disguise it. Layer by fragrant layer. So she steps into her gown, stands tall, and exits the chamber. The scent of roses follows. Briefly. Then the musk returns. You follow the Queen into her private sitting chamber, a space not meant for court business, but for the quiet rituals of royal survival. Today's discomfort. Her teeth. It's impossible not to notice. Up close, Elizabeth's smile is cautious. Tight-lipped. She rarely bares her teeth unless forced. And now you understand why. Her dental health is in a word, tragic. You're invited to sit, though you aren't offered food, thankfully, and you notice a small silver mirror, a cloth bundle, and a curious wooden pick laid out on the table beside her. These are her dental tools. The royal toothbrush of the late 16th century. More like a linen rag soaked in honey and salt, rubbed over the gums with what might be best described as wishful thinking. The queen grimaces as a servant offers her a dab of clove oil. She dabs it onto her gums herself, her hand steady but her jaw tight. That twinge of pain. Familiar to her. Elizabeth's teeth are blackened, some missing entirely. Others loosened from years of sugar consumption and poor dental care. And oh, the sugar. Elizabeth loved sweetmeats, candied violets, spiced fruit pastes, sugar-dipped almonds. These delicacies were symbols of wealth and power, imported at great cost and consumed with royal enthusiasm. It's estimated that she consumed so much sugar, her teeth began to rot in her 30s. Her breath. A whole diplomatic incident. One ambassador from Germany wrote that he was startled by the sharp perfume of her lips. A poetic way of saying, something was not right in the mouth region. You watch as she attempts to chew a soft biscuit, only to wince and set it down. Her meals these days are specially prepared, mushed, mashed, soaked in broth. Not because she's dainty, but because biting into anything firmer than a boiled pear might end in embarrassment. Or blood. Now, historians still argue whether Elizabeth had full dentures later in life. Some say yes, fashioned from ivory or even horsebone. Others believe she made do with a reduced diet and tightly pursed lips. Either way, what's clear is that her once impressive speeches were occasionally interrupted by sudden pauses, moments where she sucked gently on her cheek or pressed her tongue against a sensitive tooth. But she bore it all with trademark defiance. At one point, she famously refused treatment from her own royal dentist, a man named Dr. Burkitt. Why? She was terrified. Despite being the Queen of England, she couldn't stomach the thought of an extraction. Not even when one of her molars became badly infected. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, of a bishop volunteering to have his own tooth pulled first, right in front of her, to prove it wouldn't hurt. Elizabeth reportedly thanked him, handed back the tools, and said, "You may keep your courage. I'll keep my tooth." The chamber now grows quiet. The Queen leans back in her chair and lets her ladies gently swab her tongue with a bit of mint-soaked gauze. Her eyes flutter slightly, as if the sting of the mint brings some relief. Then, without a word, she rises, composes herself, and walks away as if her mouth isn't a medieval battlefield of decay. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Elizabeth sometimes used powdered sugar, not only as a food but also as a cosmetic. Yes, she brushed it lightly on her lips and chin for a pale, frosted effect. It made her appear angelic in candlelight. And it probably helped ruin whatever teeth she had left. As you observe her now, speaking softly to a servant, you realize her voice is different from what you expected. Low, a little raspy. Some described it as measured thunder. But you notice the catch between syllables, the careful enunciation. She speaks around her pain. And that, perhaps, is the most Elizabethan thing about her. Not the ruffs, not the politics, not the symbolism. It's the grit. She rules while her mouth aches. She smiles while her gums bleed. She delivers speeches to thousands while tasting metal at the back of her throat. It's both inspiring and, frankly, a little tragic. But she is determined. No, she must be. Because the court is full of vultures waiting for signs of weakness. A wince here, a flinch there, and the rumors would swirl. The Queen is unwell. The Queen is aging. The Queen is dying. So she refuses to flinch. A maid collects the silver mirror and wraps the wooden pick in cloth. They disappear into a drawer with a faint clunk. Another servant offers her a single sugared violet on a porcelain plate. She stares at it. Then smiles, tightly, and walks away. She's not eating it. Smart. There's a knock, soft, respectful. One of Elizabeth's personal attendants enters, balancing a curious burden, a wide, shallow, gold-rimmed ceramic bowl, covered with a velvet cloth. You follow behind as she glides through a narrow hallway toward a small, richly curtained room off the Queen's bedchamber. You've arrived at what the Tudors called the stool chamber. Not because it had chairs, though it does, but because here, nestled behind brocade drapes and golden tassels, sat the Queen's most private throne, the close stool. Her toilet. You might expect something basic, a bucket, perhaps, or a chamber pot. But Elizabeth's stool is a handcrafted piece of royal furniture. Mahogany, velvet upholstered, with hinged wooden arms and a padded seat. Underneath, a removable pewter or ceramic pan, lined with herbs, straw, or if someone's feeling fancy, ashes and petals. A far cry from plumbing, but it was what passed for sanitation in the royal court. And here's the kicker, you never did this alone. Even toileting had an audience. Enter the groom of the stool, a court position of remarkable intimacy and astonishing prestige. This man, or occasionally a trusted lady in Elizabeth's case, was responsible for attending to the Queen during her bathroom routines. Wiping, rinsing, adjusting her garments. All with absolute discretion and zero flinching. Modern historians still argue whether this role was strictly practical or deeply political. Some claim the groom of the stool was among the most trusted of the Queen's household, privy, pun very much intended, to secrets and whispered commands. Others say it was a glorified janitor's job wrapped in royal protocol. Either way, you had to be brave, loyal, and possessed of an iron stomach. Today, you're standing just outside the curtain. The Queen has entered. You hear a faint rustle of skirts. A servant hands in a small sachet of dried rosemary and marjoram, used to scatter into the pan below to help disguise the inevitable smell. She lowers herself slowly. The silence is strained. And no, she's not scrolling through her phone. Instead, you imagine her staring at the opposite wall, thinking of state matters, diplomatic frustrations, or perhaps just how much wine she drank last night. Royal bowels, after all, were no different than yours. What happens next is muffled, respectful, and blessedly brief. A maid waits with a clean cloth and a bowl of warmed rosewater. Elizabeth emerges after a moment, her expression unreadable. You pretend you've seen nothing. The cloth is removed, the pan discreetly taken away to a servant entrance. The odor lingers faintly, a mixture of perfume and human truth. It's a curious thing, really. The Queen of England, ruler of a mighty island, destroyer of the Spanish Armada, the Gloriana herself, still has to poop in a pot. And she has to do it in layers of skirts, petticoats, stockings, corsets, and linen underthings. The entire process is a logistical ballet. Servants help lift the skirts. Others hold scented gloves near her nose. One poor soul is likely in charge of watching the chamber door for wandering courtiers. You wonder how many of them know this moment is happening. Probably none. Because Elizabeth was masterful at illusion. Her public face was all power and fire. Her private moments? Quiet, controlled, cloaked in herbs and velvet. There's a fringe belief among some Tudor scholars that Elizabeth had multiple stools across her palaces, each made slightly different, each guarded like a state secret. One even theorized that she had a collapsible travel version that could be packed for long journeys. Yes, a royal porta-potty. Made of leather. With gold accents. You can't confirm that, but the mental image alone is worth the historical speculation. Back in the chamber, a fresh rush of lavender is sprinkled across the threshold as a kind of olfactory curtain. The stool is removed and replaced with a footrest. As quickly as the deed began, it vanishes, physically and symbolically. This, too, is part of the myth-making. Elizabeth's body was both mortal and sacred. She bled. She sweated. She smelled. And yes, she used the toilet. But the court worked overtime to erase those facts from daily awareness. She wasn't a woman. She was a monarch. A body rendered untouchable by sheer force of political will. Yet, as you stand here catching one final whiff of marjoram and mild regret, you feel oddly close to her. Not in the way one dreams of being close to a famous figure, but in the way you feel when you've witnessed someone's humanity laid bare. A private ritual. A porcelain reminder that the woman in the portraits, with her pale mask and jeweled ruff, was once a living, breathing human with all the vulnerabilities that entails. The curtain falls back into place. The Queen re-emerges, adjusted, powdered, unbothered. And you? You're just grateful it wasn't your turn to carry the pan. The Queen is seated again, this time in the long gallery where sunlight struggles through leaded glass, casting soft patterns on the tapestries. You've had a moment to recover from the royal potty parade, but now another chapter of Elizabeth's hygiene unfolds, her war against scent. Not to be confused with fighting odor. Oh no. Elizabeth wasn't fighting scent. She was drowning in it. This was the golden age of Tudor perfume, except, without modern chemistry, refrigeration, or antiseptic practices. Scents were heavy, oily, musky, and sometimes shockingly grotesque by today's standards. Their function wasn't to enhance but to overpower, to wage a full-scale olfactory assault against body odor, rotting teeth, and centuries of indoor air never properly ventilated. You watch as a maid approaches with a polished wooden box. Inside, rows of tiny glass bottles, each stoppered with wax and labeled in an elegant hand. Musk. Rose. Ambergris. Civet. Frankincense. Clove. Myrrh. Spikenard. Even powdered violet root. Every scent a weapon. Every weapon aimed at one unyielding enemy, the Queen's own human aroma. She selects a bottle, ambergris, aged whale vomit prized by perfumers for its complex scent and fixative properties. It smells like the sea, if the sea had a fever and a fondness for decaying wood. The Queen dabs it behind her ears with the practiced precision of someone who's used this scent every day of her adult life. It blends with the musk, derived from the gland of the male musk deer, an odor both primal and oddly sweet. And here's your quirky tidbit, these scents weren't just for her. The court was expected to keep up. Gentlemen carried scented handkerchiefs. Ladies wore pomanders, tiny decorative orbs filled with herbs and spices, tied to their girdles or pinned to their bodices. The more powerful you were, the stronger your smell. Some took it further. Elizabeth's gloves were custom scented, leather steeped in orris root and marinated in floral oils. Her ruffs were often sprinkled with rosewater before being starched stiff. Her wigs were dusted with crushed lavender. Her bedding stuffed with dried marjoram, chamomile, and mint. Even her fans, delicate instruments of social choreography, were tools of perfume distribution. Each flick of the wrist sent a wave of artificially orchestrated garden air through the room, giving everyone a break from the less pleasant background notes. And yet, despite all these efforts, the stink still lingered. You begin to suspect that every scent merely fought a losing battle against the ever-present tide of sweat, decay, and stagnant laundry. Now, historians still argue whether Elizabeth genuinely loved these overpowering aromas or simply endured them as a necessity. One scholar theorizes that the Queen, as she aged and her senses dulled, grew to depend on stronger and stronger perfumes just to feel clean. Another suggests she associated these odors with her identity. The more potent the scent cloud, the more complete the transformation from mortal woman to untouchable monarch. Today, the Queen seems in a contemplative mood. She twirls a small bundle in her fingers, a sweet bag, embroidered with her initials and filled with cloves, cinnamon, and a hint of camphor. She occasionally lifts it to her nose and inhales deeply. The court has gone quiet. Some are napping discreetly in corners. One lady-in-waiting fans herself with a book. Another pats her neck with a sachet. You begin to feel that everything in this room is either perfumed or sweating under the effort of appearing not to. You lean in, just enough to catch a whiff of the Queen's own layered scent. It's like walking into a garden that's been set on fire, doused in wine, and abandoned for a few days. Not necessarily unpleasant, just dense. Old flowers, animal musk, dusty wood, and something faintly medicinal. There's a reason she's called the scented sovereign in some poems. And yet, underneath all this pageantry, you begin to notice cracks. The oils have stained her collar. The perfume has soaked through the ruff, giving it a yellowed edge. Her gloves, once white, are now a smudged cream. You realize this isn't luxury. This is maintenance. Desperation. Self-preservation via sandalwood and sweat. There's one final touch. A servant approaches with a silver censer. A puff of burning frankincense curls into the air. The Queen watches it rise with calm interest, then leans slightly forward to let the smoke pass over her face. Not to be dramatic, but it's a bit like watching a minor exorcism. As if she's driving away the last ghosts of body odor that her battalion of rose petals couldn't vanquish. And just as suddenly as it began, the perfume ritual ends. Elizabeth rises, swathed in a halo of fragrance so potent you half expect bees to follow her. Her scent will remain in this room long after she's gone. Embedded in every cushion, every curtain, every person. Because in this court, you don't remember the Queen by her words or her presence. You remember her by her smell. The royal gardens beckon. Not because they're peaceful, though the neatly trimmed box hedges and nodding tulips do offer a moment of greenery. But because the Queen, in a rare flush of good mood, has announced that she will take the air. You, of course, follow. But this is no gentle stroll. This is a public performance of health and cleanliness. Elizabeth's hygiene, remember, isn't limited to her skin or scent. It extends to how she manages her body in full view of the world. In this case, her obsession with controlling her breath and posture. She walks slowly, deliberately, hands clasped just so, spine unyieldingly straight. Every inch of her figure has been disciplined into control. Her movements are elegant, but unnatural, like a puppet trained not to betray its joints. Why such care? Because to appear disheveled, hunched, or winded was to appear mortal. And being mortal was dangerous. The Tudor belief was that breath, your literal breath, was a marker of health and moral character. A foul mouth meant foul humors. A sharp cough might suggest tuberculosis. A rattling wheeze. Weakness. And Elizabeth Tudor could never afford to be seen as weak. So she trained her breath. You overhear one courtier mutter that she counts her inhalations like a miser. You notice she breathes shallowly through her nose, mouth always closed, lips pursed delicately. When she speaks, it is on carefully metered exhalations. Never a gasp. Never a pant. Never even a clearing of the throat. And here's a detail you weren't expecting: she gargles religiously, sometimes with a wine vinegar and honey concoction believed to kill mouth odor and keep her voice smooth. Her physician records that she uses myrrh and burnt alum as part of a morning rinse. It's all part of a plan, not just for hygiene, but for dominance. You imagine the Queen standing before her mirror in the morning, gargling like a dragon, and pausing mid-rinse to issue a command. Now for your quirky tidbit: she also chewed on angelica root, a bitter herb believed to ward off plague and cleanse the breath. The smell was pungent. Like celery that had been left out in the rain, but it was fashionable among nobility who feared death more than flavor. She didn't chew gum, of course. She nibbled medicinally. With one gloved hand raised to her mouth and a dainty crunch, as if keeping her molars sharp just in case she needed to bite back at Spain. Historians still argue whether this obsession with breath was practical or theatrical. Some suggest she feared oral disease more than any other affliction. After all, a bad tooth infection could kill you back then. Others believe she deliberately controlled every aspect of her presence, down to the airflow between sentences, to preserve her myth. You'd believe either one. As the queen turns a corner near the knot garden, you notice a servant discreetly offering her a linen cloth. She accepts, dabs her lips, and returns it, all without breaking stride. The motion is so smooth it looks choreographed. Nearby, a musician plays a soft lute melody. Another noblewoman makes a faint joke about court life, something about Lord Essex's last bath being closer to the Queen Mary's birth than the present moment. Elizabeth chuckles politely, but never shows teeth. Her smiles are tight. Controlled. Because, as you learned earlier, her dental hygiene wasn't quite exemplary. Which brings you to another garden moment worth remembering. Her personal attendants carry herbs in their sleeves. Rosemary. Thyme. Mint. Not for cooking. For sniffing. They hold them near the nose while walking behind the queen, not just to enjoy their own fresh experience, but, perhaps, to shield themselves. This practice, common in plague times, persisted at court as a type of mobile air filter. And yes, you have to ask yourself, if the queen were truly fragrant as a spring meadow, would her maids still be hiding behind bouquets? A bee floats lazily past. Elizabeth flinches slightly, then pretends she didn't. You get the sense that she hates the idea of sweating, even a single bead. Heat means moisture. Moisture means odor. Odor means failure. She turns again, glancing briefly over her shoulder, as if checking to see whether anyone noticed that moment of very human discomfort. You pretend you didn't. And that's when you realize something subtle but chilling: the queen does not breathe freely. She breathes strategically. Her lungs, her gait, her bearing, these are not random. They are managed. Engineered. Groomed like a rosebush until all wildness has been trimmed away. And somehow, that makes her even more formidable. This isn't a woman who is merely clean. This is a woman who has weaponized her hygiene, turned every inhale and exhale into a form of rule. And as she exits the garden, her silks trailing behind her like a cloud of authority, you catch yourself mirroring her posture. You too straighten your back. You purse your lips. Because in the presence of Elizabeth, even your breath must be tidy. You're back inside now, trailing the queen through the shaded halls of Richmond Palace, where the sunlight turns amber through thick, leaded windows. The corridors smell faintly of lavender, beeswax, and something less lovely, something like mildew and human effort, trying hard not to be noticed. This next chamber is where we must confront the queen's most private and awkward hygienic burden, her bowels. Yes. Her Majesty must go, same as the rest of us. And you're about to learn just how gloriously complicated that becomes when the most powerful woman in England needs to answer nature's call. But let's not be crude. You're not just imagining a toilet here, because the Tudor throne room was not what you might think. You're looking at a close stool, a sort of portable commode that resembles a fine wooden chair, complete with padded velvet seat, rich embroidery, and an opening underneath where a pewter chamber pot sits snugly. Elizabeth's, of course, is custom-built. Carved oak. Crimson damask. Gold trim. It's a toilet, yes, but it's also a throne. Literally. Now, she does not carry it herself. That task falls to her, groom of the stool, one of the most bizarre and paradoxically powerful roles at court. Imagine being the royal bathroom valet, privy to your monarch's most intimate routines, yet ranking above half the nobility because of that trust. Historians still argue whether the position was purely logistical or veered into political intimacy. But we know this: Elizabeth's personal groom was Margaret Bridges, later Lady Norreys, a noblewoman, not a servant. And she would be responsible not just for carrying the close stool, but for managing the linens, fetching scented water, and assisting the queen with undergarments. Imagine the delicacy that required. Elizabeth, famously proud and private, would likely make small talk while maintaining complete denial of what was happening. A woman raised to appear beyond the flesh. And here you are, standing 10 feet away as perfumed water is poured behind a screen. One mainstream fact. Tudor physicians believed that holding in waste was dangerously unhealthy. Clogged bowels could lead to all manner of humoral imbalances. Yet Elizabeth frequently resisted regular movement. She was prone to chronic constipation, likely caused by stress, limited exercise, and a diet low in fiber but high in rich meats and cheese. To combat this, she used laxative tonics, rhubarb, senna, and bitter purgatives. One record mentions her drinking a mixture of white wine and powdered antimony, a toxic metal that forced evacuation, often violently. Let that sink in. The Queen of England risking organ damage just to have a bowel movement on schedule. And here's your quirky tidbit: Elizabeth supposedly once remarked, "I would rather die a virgin than be caught uncomposed upon my stool." Whether true or apocryphal, it captures her attitude exactly. But even more fascinating, she had no indoor plumbing. The chamber pot from the close stool had to be manually emptied by servants, often into cesspits behind the palace. Sometimes it was discreet, sometimes not. And in summer, the stench became a diplomatic issue. In one letter, a French ambassador wrote that the royal apartments are rich, and their perfumes of lavender and lemon most pleasing, yet at the rear wall, where the servants pour the refuse, the very rats have fled. So, even the Virgin Queen had to face the same grim smell as everyone else, just through layers of silk and formality. And while the stool itself was ornate, the cleaning process wasn't. Linen cloths would be used, then soaked in rosewater or vinegar and laundered by hand. There were no rolls of soft paper. The attendants dealt with the results in silence, as if handling holy relics. You suspect no one was allowed to grimace. What you don't suspect, though, is that the whole act was cloaked in ritual. Elizabeth would set a time. The room would be cleared. A screen erected. The water readied. Herbs burned. And then, silence. 5, 10, maybe 20 minutes. Then, a single knock. The groom of the stool re-enters, calm, hands gloved, bearing warm cloths and fresh undergarments if needed. And no one ever speaks of it again. No jesters make jokes. No scribes scribble. Even her enemies never dared hint at Elizabeth's human functions. To them, she was beyond digestion. Beyond relief. But you've just seen the truth behind the tapestry. You watched the most feared and admired monarch in Europe navigate a most universal indignity with velvet, vinegar, and veiled glances. And somehow, that makes her more real, and more terrifying. Because it reminds you that all her control, all her studied image, was a performance built atop an unchangeable truth. Even Queen's poop. Now the sun begins to slant low through the leaded windows, painting long amber stripes across the parquet floors. You follow Elizabeth once more, her skirts swishing with deliberate rhythm as she sweeps down a hallway, past curious tapestries and tiny, beady-eyed courtiers who curtsy and withdraw the moment she turns her gaze. Where is she headed? To one of the strangest rooms in her entire courtly routine, the sweating chamber. Yes. Think of it as her version of a spa day, though this is not the kind of luxury treatment you'd post on social media. This is steamy, medieval, herbal, and just a little bit horrifying. Inside the small stone chamber, windowless, dim, and close, you feel your breath shorten. The walls are damp. A fire pit burns in a small hearth, heating stones that radiate almost suffocating warmth. Buckets of water laced with herbs, sage, lavender, marjoram, are tossed onto the stones by servants, releasing great whooshes of steam. Elizabeth is led in, clad in a linen shift already damp with sweat. And she stands. Just stands. Or sometimes sits on a wooden stool. She doesn't speak. She sweats. This was her most trusted method of balancing the humors, a core belief of Tudor medicine. Mainstream physicians insisted that sweating helped purge the body of excess black bile and yellow bile, preventing disease. It wasn't about looking fresh, it was about survival. But here's the quirky bit: Elizabeth may have actually used the sweating chamber as a substitute for bathing itself. Remember, she bathed infrequently. Her skin, though painted pale with ceruse, was delicate. Full immersion in water was still regarded by many physicians as risky. It could open the pores too much, inviting plague or chill. But sweating? Controlled. Herbal. And always supervised. She could sweat out her impurities in 30 minutes and then dry off with fresh linens and scent herself with oils. It felt medicinal rather than cosmetic. There are accounts, vague, reverent, tiptoeing, that suggest this was sometimes her only cleansing for weeks at a time. You picture it now, the queen, flushed and breathless, linen clinging to her spine, red-faced from steam, emerging from the haze like a ghost reborn. Historians still argue, as they always do, about how often she truly relied on this chamber. Some suggest she used it only in times of stress or illness. Others claim it was a bi-weekly ritual, a private sanctum where she could reflect without her wig or corset, just her, steam, and silence. But let's not forget the smell. Yes. You were thinking it. There's no eucalyptus or cucumber melon in here. Even with sage and thyme, the room is a brew of sweat, sour linen, and herbs desperately trying to cover the truth. It is, not elegant. Yet no one dared say so. If anything, the Queen's sweating sessions were considered a moment of sacred cleansing, a necessary purgation for a body meant to embody the soul of England. Now a servant brings in a dish of rosemary vinegar, which she dips into with cloths to dab the Queen's neck, armpits, even behind her ears. It stings a little. Elizabeth winces. But she never complains. She's trained herself out of complaint. Complaining is for wives and barmaids, not queens. As she dries, another servant hands her a hollowed-out pomander, filled with clove-studded oranges, nutmeg, and cinnamon bark. It's her weapon against the return of the world stinks. She tucks it into a sleeve or holds it in a gloved hand, always at the ready. You can't help but notice how delicate she looks post-sweat, how very human. Her skin, stripped of powder, is flushed and textured. Her hairline, uneven beneath the wig cap. Her hands, older than you expected, trembling just slightly as she takes the pomander. And yet, the transformation is rapid. Linens whisked away. Fresh underlayers, perfumed. Wig pinned back in place. Face re-whitened with alarming speed. Within minutes, the illusion is restored, the virgin monarch, the glittering myth. But you saw her just now. You saw the sweat drip down the bridge of her nose. You saw the woman beneath the mask. And it's oddly, admirable. Not that she smells better now, but that she allows herself this odd, intense ritual, rooted in old medicine and self-discipline, because she knows it keeps the myth running. Because in her mind, queens do not sweat. Only mortals do. So she does it in secret. Silently. Then scrubs it from history with scented oils and politics. And by the time you follow her out of the sweating chamber, you've almost convinced yourself you imagined it all. The heat. The vinegar. The human side of majesty. Almost. You trail after her once more, though by now, the Queen has resumed her carefully choreographed distance, aloof, pristine, and powdered like a portrait brought to life. Her every step is dictated not by whim, but by etiquette layered over expectation, layered again by paranoia. Because now it's time for one of her most fastidious, and frankly, eyebrow-raising, habits, tooth care. Yes, we're going there. The royal mouth. You might imagine, given her wealth, Elizabeth had access to some early form of proper dental hygiene. A silver toothbrush? Maybe a minty Tudor toothpaste? Oh no. Brace yourself. The Queen's tooth care routine was intense. And not especially effective. In fact, by her later years, she had a notorious sweet tooth and an equally notorious set of teeth to match, blackened, aching, and in some cases, outright missing. But tonight, she's still relatively young. She hasn't lost too many yet. And she's determined to keep her smile in place. You watch as she sits before a small gilded mirror. A servant brings a slender, carved stick, what we'd now call a toothpick, but more like a splintered twig soaked in rose water and clove oil. Elizabeth takes it between her gloved fingers and delicately scrapes between her front teeth. There's no rinsing. No spitting. No sink. She's doing this, silently, over a linen cloth held beneath her chin. Clove oil masks the worst of it, numbing her gums slightly. But the truth is, she's already beginning to suffer. Her molars, especially the back ones, ache constantly from decay caused by sugar, a luxury she enjoys daily in candied violets, marmalades, and those famous sweetmeats imported from Italy and Spain. She won't stop eating them, of course. She's the queen. Denial is not part of the crown's vocabulary. But she will try, desperately, to counteract the rot. One of her favorite remedies is a mixture of burnt salt and honey, mashed into a gritty paste and rubbed along the gums with linen. This, people believed, would draw out toxins and reduce inflammation. It didn't. But it felt like doing something, and that was often enough in Tudor medicine. Now here's the fun, quirky bit. Elizabeth also owned tooth powder recipes that included ground coral, eggshells, crushed pumice, and, wait for it, charcoal from rosemary branches. You may laugh, but charcoal tooth powder is trending again today, albeit in a far less medieval form. Still, historians still argue whether her servants applied the charcoal paste directly to her teeth or if it was simply dusted on and brushed with linen. Either way, it wasn't gentle. It scratched the enamel, darkened the crevices, and likely caused more harm than help. Yet, for a time, it gave her that matte white smile, at least when paired with enough cerise paint on her lips and cheeks to create contrast. An illusion, as always, was everything. The royal mouth, however, would soon become a battleground. By the 1580s, foreign ambassadors would whisper that the queen spoke with difficulty, especially when angry. Her words slurred. Her mouth puckered oddly. One man recorded how she kept one side of her face turned away when speaking. Not modesty, just a missing back tooth or two. But that's later. Tonight, she still has her smile. And when she finally stands and pats the corners of her mouth with a square of rose-scented silk, she's satisfied. Her teeth might throb, but her breath, well, at least it's clove-laced. She rises and moves toward the bedchamber. You follow her through candlelit halls, past a wall tapestry that shows a lion licking a bleeding heart. You glance at it for just a moment too long, and when you turn back, she's already 10 steps ahead. Of course she is. You wonder, though, if she ever feared what people thought about her teeth. After all, image was everything. Did she dread opening her mouth too wide at court? Was she embarrassed when food lodged in her molars, or when the ache became too sharp to smile? Possibly. But probably not for long. Because Elizabeth, for all her vanity and polish, was also tough as old nails. When one particularly decayed tooth gave her such pain she could hardly speak, her doctors recommended extraction. She refused. Not until the Archbishop of Canterbury had a bad tooth pulled first, in front of her. Yes. She made him suffer the operation just to prove it wouldn't kill her. He did. It didn't. So she agreed. They tied a linen band around her head, pressed iron forceps into her mouth, and ripped the tooth free with nothing but a prayer and a cup of wine. You wince. But she didn't. Not once, they say. Because monarchs don't cry. And if their teeth rot from sugar and bad science, well, they just cover their mouths when they laugh. Or better yet, they don't laugh at all. You trail behind her again, but now it's slower, quieter. The queen's steps are soft against the thick wool carpets, her silks rustling like a whisper. Ahead lies her most private space, the royal bedchamber, but don't let that title fool you into imagining a cozy nest of velvet and scented linens. No, this is Tudor hygiene, remember the chamber is cold. Not just chilly, damp cold, like a cathedral left unheated in February. The stone walls seem to breathe out moisture. A fire crackles low in the hearth, doing its best, but you can still see your breath fog slightly in the candlelight. And there, in the center, stands the royal bed, an enormous four-poster affair with deep crimson hangings. It looks impressive, until you realize just how much of it was designed not for comfort, but for status. The mattress is lumpy, stuffed with straw and wool. The sheets? Fine linen, yes, but rarely washed. Changing bedding was a royal event in itself, not done weekly but seasonally, unless soiled. And beneath that elegant quilt? Lice. Almost certainly. Everyone had them. Even the Virgin Queen. A servant hurries ahead to stoke the fire, while another steps forward with a metal pot, steaming gently. You lean in, thinking perhaps it's tea. Nope. It's urine. Yes, it's time for one of Elizabeth's stranger night rituals, foot bathing in warm urine. Not her own, at least, not always. Collected from servants and stable boys, it was believed to soften skin, draw out pain, and ward off infections. And you know what? Chemically speaking, it actually had some mild antiseptic properties. Still, soaking your royal toes in a stranger's pee is a choice. You watch her lift the hem of her nightgown, embroidered with tiny Tudor roses, and slip her pale, slender feet into the basin. She doesn't flinch. She's used to this. As she soaks, another maid approaches with a brush, long-handled, made of boar's hair, and begins to gently stroke her back through the thin linen of her gown. This isn't affection. It's dry brushing, a Tudor alternative to bathing. They believed it opened pores, improved humors, and scraped away excess bile. And honestly, it probably did feel kind of nice. After all, remember, Elizabeth bathed once a month at most. In winter, not at all. Dry brushing and heavy perfumes filled the gap. Speaking of perfumes, a third servant begins to waft a censer, a swinging metal bowl filled with burning herbs and fragrant resins. Lavender. Sage. Frankincense. The smoke curls around the queen's hair, which has been loosened now and falls down her back like a sheet of burnished copper. She breathes deeply. You can almost see the stress of the day evaporate in those plumes. Here's your quirky fact for the night: Elizabeth had custom scents made not only for her body, but also for her rooms. She ordered sachets of dried petals and spices to be sewn into her bed hangings. Some even included crushed pearls and deer musk. Her signature scent. Historians suspect orris root, a powder made from the iris flower that smells like violet and was wildly popular at court. Now, finally, she prepares for sleep. But not before one last ritual. She extends her hand, and a lady-in-waiting presents a silver pomander, a small, filigreed ball that opens like a locket. Inside are spices and dried herbs, including cloves, nutmeg, and sometimes even cinnamon bark soaked in vinegar. Elizabeth lifts it to her nose. A few deep inhales. Why? Because she believes it will protect her from miasma, the deadly, bad air said to carry plague and fever. And given the condition of the Thames and the occasional whiff from her own courtiers, you can't really blame her. Now, she moves toward the bed. Two maids step forward to assist, lifting the covers and smoothing the pillows, one of goose down, one of buckwheat. Elizabeth climbs in with care, her nightgown barely rustling. The sheets are cold. She does not shiver. Instead, she nods once. The maids back away. One blows out the main candelabra, another pulls the bed curtains tight. Darkness. Silence. You wait. Maybe she's asleep already. Not yet. Because through the heavy curtains, you can still hear the soft, repetitive whisper of Elizabeth reciting prayers. Quietly. Rhythmically. Like breathing. Some nights, she prays for her people. Other nights, for her enemies. Often, she prays just for strength, to hold the court together, to keep her throne, to silence the aches in her jaw or the fear of assassination in her heart. She's still only human, after all. But a human wrapped in 6 layers of silk, soaked in perfume, guarded by spies, and plagued by lice. Sleep comes eventually. It has to. And as the embers in the hearth turn to ash, and the scent of clove and lavender fades into the chill, you, quietly, respectfully, step back from the bed. She'll wake again soon. To power. To court. To more chalk paint and sugar aches. But for now, she sleeps like a queen. You tiptoe out of her bedchamber, trying not to disturb even the flicker of candlelight. The thick door closes behind you with a thud that somehow still sounds muffled in all this old Tudor stone. And just like that, we're back in the private wing of the royal palace, still royal, still opulent, but now mostly sleeping. Mostly. Because even as Elizabeth I rests, the palace doesn't. And certainly not the people who deal with waste. Remember all that urine? All those chamber pots? Someone has to manage it. Welcome to the world of the royal gong farmers. Yes, that's the actual title. It sounds oddly cheerful, but don't be fooled. Their job was grim, removing human waste from the royal privies, garderobes, and chamber pots, and carrying it off to dumping pits or, in some cases, farms. If you think Elizabeth's life was all pearls and poetry, just imagine her slumbering in perfumed peace while a sweating man is hauling buckets of noble feces past the tapestry-lined halls. You follow one now. A narrow figure in rough wool, face half covered with a cloth soaked in vinegar. A primitive attempt at protection from what they called night air. And yes, in the middle of the night, these workers quietly move through the hidden corridors, collect the pots, and trudge out toward the palace cesspits. What were these cesspits like? Imagine a pit, stone-lined, built underground, where layers of waste slowly accumulated. Add time. Add the heat of summer. Then imagine the stench. One ambassador once described the reek from the palace drains as an insult to all creation. And yet, despite this filth, Elizabeth's palaces were considered relatively well managed. There were systems, secret tunnels, pipes, and servants who did little else but scrape, scrub, and cover bad smells with herbs, ash, or quicklime. But even with all that, the stink lingered. Here's a quirky tidbit. Elizabeth was so sensitive to odors that she reportedly had fresh rushes laid down daily in certain rooms. The Tudor version of changing the carpet. These were often mixed with lavender, mint, or even marjoram. But over time, the rushes trapped debris, food crumbs, hair, and other things. So while they smelled fresh at first, let's just say the illusion didn't last. As you walk deeper into the palace's bowels, you pass a side room, small, dim, and thick with the smell of smoke and resin. Inside, a tired-looking servant is heating vinegar over hot coals. Why? To cleanse the air, they believe. This was known as fumigation and was thought to keep away pestilence. Elizabeth herself sometimes insisted on vinegar being sprinkled in hallways before she walked through them. Historians still argue whether any of these methods actually helped fight disease or simply made the surroundings less unbearable. But in an era when germs weren't even a concept, vinegar and roses were the best armor available. Now here's a not-so-fun fact. Even though Elizabeth had some of the best sanitation the 16th century could muster, outbreaks of plague and typhus still swept through her courts. Entire sections of the palace would be sealed off. Servants dismissed. Tapestries burned. And Elizabeth, ever cautious, would flee to the countryside at the first sign of sickness, taking only a skeleton crew with her. So in a sense, this after-hours chaos, the scrubbing, the hauling, the vinegar fumes, it's not just about smell. It's about survival. You turn a corner and bump, gently, into a maid carrying a bucket. She offers a sleepy smile, then continues down the corridor toward a small door. Inside, One of Elizabeth's secret privy rooms. Hidden behind a panel, down a hallway no courtier would dare walk without permission. You peek in after her, and sure enough, there it is, a simple wooden seat with a ceramic bowl beneath. Nothing fancy. No gold trim. Just practical privacy for a woman who ruled a nation. But even here, the Queen left her mark. Literally. Her initials, VR, are carved into the paneling. And next to the seat, a bundle of cloth wipes, soaked in rose water. Toilet paper wouldn't be invented for another few hundred years. Royals used cloth. Servants used leaves. Some used straw. And that's all I'll say about that. You step back, letting the maid work, and continue down another hallway. Everywhere you turn, there's quiet activity. A boy polishing brass candlesticks. A woman replacing burnt herbs in wall sconces. Another servant lifting a mouse from a trap beneath a tapestry. The palace never sleeps, it refreshes, resets itself, and scrubs away the day's odors and decay. And so, while Elizabeth I drifts in her perfumed bed, her empire of scent, sweat, and subtle hygiene rituals keeps turning. It's a reminder, really, that even queens, especially queens, are always being cleaned up after. It's nearing dawn, and you're now walking toward the part of the palace few ever saw awake. The Queen's morning chamber. The hush in the air is soft, expectant. Servants whisper instead of speak. Embers crackle low in the hearths. And a pale wash of blue daylight is just beginning to bleed through the mullioned windows. Soon, Elizabeth will rise, and with her, a hygienic performance begins. Yes, performance. Because for all her rituals of privacy, Elizabeth's morning routine was very much a public affair. Not for everyone, of course, but for a select, tightly choreographed group of ladies and chamber servants who formed what was known as the Privy Chamber, her most trusted attendants, the ones who saw her at her most vulnerable, most unpainted. You duck into an alcove as you hear soft footsteps and whispers. Already, a lady-in-waiting is arranging glass bottles on a wooden tray. Vinegar. Rosewater. Spirit of lavender. And that odd-smelling greenish cream made from lard and herbs, applied gently to soothe cracked winter skin. Elizabeth's personal hygiene habits were a curious balance of self-discipline and secrecy. Despite popular myth, she didn't bathe only once a month, though full immersions were rare. Instead, she preferred frequent washing with cloth and basin, a method called dry bathing. Think sponge bath, minus the sponge, plus linen cloth steeped in warmed herbal water. You hear the gentle slosh of one such basin now, being prepared near the hearth. The Queen's skin had to be both cleaned and preserved. After all, under the layers of makeup and symbolic white face paint was still a human woman aging under pressure. Every morning, her attendants would gently dab her hands, face, and arms with cloths soaked in warm milk and rosewater, believed to soften the skin and protect it from the elements. Then comes the hair. Long, red, and fake. Yes, by her later years, Elizabeth's iconic auburn hair had mostly vanished, and she wore elaborate wigs. Still, her scalp was wiped clean each morning with cloth scented with rosemary or chamomile, sometimes even brushed with perfumed oils to fend off lice and dryness. And the wigs? Dusted with starch and scented powder, stored carefully to keep moths away. You lean against the wall as the ceremonial dressing begins. The Queen, likely already awake, is sitting behind her privacy screen. No one but her closest companion helps her change from her nightgown. A basin of clean water is presented. She dips her hands. A fresh linen underdress follows. And then, the transformation begins. Elizabeth was obsessed with personal control, of her image, her body, her power. Hygiene was part of that. After her wash, her face is patted dry, and the application of ceruse begins. Ceruse was a deadly concoction of white lead and vinegar, slathered on the face to achieve the iconic pale look. It cracked. It flaked. And yet, Elizabeth wore it daily. Sometimes so thick that contemporaries said her real face vanished beneath it. Scholars still argue whether Elizabeth knew the full dangers of ceruse or simply accepted the price. After all, she lived in an age when fair skin was a symbol of nobility and virtue. Darker skin meant labor, outdoor work, and commonness. The queen could not afford to appear ordinary. Next, the rouge. A mixture of crushed cochineal beetles, egg whites, and sometimes mercury, applied delicately to cheeks and lips. Dangerous? Absolutely. But beautiful, in a mannered, courtly way. You're watching history be painted in real time. Here's a fringe tidbit: Elizabeth sometimes chewed cloves or cinnamon bark to freshen her breath. And if a tooth hurt, and many did, she'd rinse with wine, or rub her gums with honey and herbs. She famously refused to let her physicians pull her decaying teeth, once making a bishop undergo the procedure first to show her it wasn't fatal. You wince, imagining the state of that royal mouth. And yet, she smiled. Carefully. Sparingly. Strategically. As her makeup hardens in the soft morning air, Elizabeth sits still, meditative, perhaps. This isn't just vanity. It's armor. Every layer shields her from scrutiny, from rivals, from time itself. She's not merely a monarch. She's becoming the Virgin Queen, sculpted in powder and rosewater. Around you, the chamber brightens. Sunlight slips past the curtains. The perfumed smoke of sandalwood rises in lazy swirls toward the ceiling. The finishing touches go on: ruffled collar, pearl earrings, a final spritz of orange blossom water dabbed behind each ear. You catch a glimpse as she rises. Tall. Pale. Impossibly regal. Every trace of sleep, age, and flesh carefully managed and masked. The door opens, and she steps into the waiting world. You trail just behind her as Elizabeth strides into the outer chamber, every inch the untouchable queen. And yet you can't help but remember the scent of vinegar and milk, the crack of lead-based paint on her cheeks, the ache in her jaw from another unpulled tooth. Her morning performance is complete, but it must last all day. Because from this moment on, Elizabeth I must be flawless. Not just in mind or command, but in appearance. Every ambassador, every visiting noble, every scheming courtier must see her not as a woman in her 60s with thinning hair and stained teeth, but as the eternal monarch, ever youthful, ever pure, ever unblemished. Personal hygiene, for Elizabeth, wasn't about health. It was about power. Perception. Control. You shadow her through the palace corridors. The scent of her perfume, rose, musk, and bitter herbs, drifts around her like a force field. She doesn't walk. She glides. Even her gloves are perfumed, laced inside with dried angelica root and stitched with fragrant oils to ward off disease. And perhaps to mask her own body's scent after days without a true bath. The irony, of course, is that many around her stank far worse. Courtiers often bathed far less frequently, relying on powders and orange pomanders, little spiced orbs hung from belts, to muffle their odor. The entire court smelled like a collision between a spice market and a cellar. But Elizabeth? Elizabeth had to seem cleaner than clean. Above it all. And yet, the labor behind that illusion? Hidden. You pause outside the council chamber as she disappears behind oak doors, her presence replacing her body. But for those who knew, the close maids, the silent servants, maybe even you, it's impossible to forget the layers of work beneath that image. The rituals of washing, of masking, of enduring. Her face may be powdered, but the exhaustion behind it is real. There's something heartbreakingly human in it all. Now, let's indulge a final oddity. Because what could be more Elizabethan than a monarch who left detailed personal instructions for the scent of her laundry? Lavender, rose, thyme, but never lemon, it gave her headaches. Even her linen shifts, changed almost daily, were expected to be scented a certain way, washed by a trusted few, and returned precisely folded. Laundry wasn't just laundry. It was a matter of statecraft. And still, historians argue whether Elizabeth's obsession with purity came from genuine personal preference, or whether it was a lifelong reaction to deep anxiety, the need to control everything she could, because so much had always been out of reach. You take one last look at the morning chamber, now empty. The basin still steams faintly. The combs lie quiet. The rosewater has gone cold. The Queen will return here tonight to undress, to strip away the layers, to sleep, perhaps fitfully, certainly guarded, and then to do it all again tomorrow. Because that's what queens do. Even when the paint stings. Even when the corset bites. Even when the candles flicker out and no one is left to admire the mask. Elizabeth ruled not just with her crown, but with her body, carefully curated and fiercely maintained. Every scented cloth, every rose salve dabbed onto skin, every lace glove hiding her fingers, each was a declaration of sovereignty. And in the end, her hygiene wasn't horrifying because it was lacking. It was horrifying because it was relentless. You can still smell the rosewater, can't you? It clings to your senses like memory, floral, sweet, just faintly sour underneath. The Queen is gone now. Her chambers are quiet. And your footsteps echo softly down the stone corridor, the kind of soft echo that feels like it belongs in a dream. Take a breath. Let it drift out slowly. There's a peculiar comfort in how Elizabeth's world was both vast and tiny at once. She ruled empires, signed death warrants, and silenced whole rooms with a glance. And yet she also worried about wrinkles, perfumed her gloves, and argued over the scent of laundry soap. Monarchs are still human, no matter how carefully they paint themselves in lead and legend. Your shoes scuff gently across the rushes. The palace is darker now, lamplight flickering low along the walls, like stars on a dimming sky. Somewhere behind you, a servant folds the Queen's linen nightgown, still warm from the hearth. You reach a small window, and through it you see the faintest tint of dawn, pale, quiet, calm. Just like you are now. Let your shoulders sink. Let your jaw soften. The world outside the window can wait. For now, you're here, wrapped in quiet, carried on the slow, steady rhythm of centuries. No more vinegar. No more paint. Just rest. Just peace. Just sleep.